Have you ever felt trapped into the need to write series?
I felt conflicted. On the one hand, I enjoy getting into the depth of a setting and characters and their development. On the other hand, there are other things I want to look at and other things I want to do. And it's sort of hard when I've done a project for 6 massive volumes and people are saying, well, why aren't you doing more? And well, because I don't have anything fresh or different I want to do with that, and I do not want to be like, for example, Robert Parker, the mystery writer who died a couple years ago. My husband and I both liked his Spencer books a lot, but toward the end, the amount of white space, I mean, they were barely the length of a novella, and the publisher was doing everything they could to make it look like it was a full-length novel, huge margins and very short chapters with lots of white space at the ends. And my feeling is I never want to disappoint my readers by having them pick up a book that I'm less than passionate about. But sometimes I feel a little bit trapped by the reader expectation that I should keep doing the same thing even if I can't do it well. And that is a conflict. If I've got a great idea for another Firekeeper book, I'd do it. But I don't want to just do it because that's the only thing that I am allowed to do.
Do you, if you flip it around as a reader, do you find, when you switch perspective, so as a writer, of course, you might get kind of bored with something, or like you said, you might just not have anything fresh to say, be essentially repeating yourself, and that doesn't interest you, so you want to write something else. But do you ever find yourself in the reader's position going, oh, come on, write one more book in that series?
Sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. If an author does it well, yes. Really good example of an author who can continue a series, or at least a series setting, without boring me is Tamara Pierce. She's a YA fantasy author. A good example is her Winding Circle books. In the first 4 Winding Circle books, her characters are really quite young. I can't remember if they're 10 or 11 or 12, but they're very young. And in the next set we've jumped a couple of years. And in the next set, they're actually young adults. In fact, when I went to buy this weekend the most recently released one, Battle Magic, I was over at Alamosa Books on off Paseo del Norte here in town, and they had Battle Magic in their young adult section, which is in a separate building, and the rest of the series over in the other building, which I thought was a little bit bad on their case, because most people, want to be able to find all of a series in one place. But Tammy does it well. She allows her characters to grow, develop, and change without becoming parodies of themselves. Whereas, for example, to use Robert Parker as an example, his characters became parodies of themselves. Spencer's best buddy / sidekick by the end of the series is a black guy named Hawk. Now, early in the books, Hawk and Spencer are actually on the opposite sides of a question. And there are a couple of books where they begin to become buddies, then they actually begin to work together. And Hawk always is described as having an extraordinary ability to track. You want a suspect shadowed, even though that this is a big, mean-looking black guy, Hawk will do it, and no one will notice it. But in one of the later books, Hawk is shadowing someone on a country road in a car. I'm sorry, but whatever ability he has to blend in a crowd goes away once he's in a car on a lonely country road. And I felt like Parker had lost touch with his characters. Hawk had become a parody of Hawk, almost a superhero who could just magically follow anyone, no matter. And so I'll go both ways. Some authors write well enough that, yes, my reaction is to say, please do more. Other authors, I want to say, you used to be really good. Get out of this rut. I don't care how much money they're paying you, and show me what you can do. And that may be my English professor side being kind of ruthless.
Yeah, I think, I can't speak for anyone else, as a reader, for me the attraction to the continuing series, of course everyone has favorite series where you sort of peter up reading them because they just sort of lose the juice or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But there's so many books out there, and it's hard to find stuff that you really like.
Mm-hmm. It is.
I mean, it's not too hard to find stuff that, is okay, but that you really connect with and really enjoy. So when you find a rich vein of something.
And you're passionate about it, you want more of that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I agree. The other thing that's strange from a writer's standpoint is when you write a book that was meant to be one book, and people start writing you and saying, can I have the sequel? Child of a Rainless Year was never meant to be anything but a standalone, but I frequently get requests for a sequel to it. I find myself thinking, well, what would the sequel be? The book starts out with 51-year-old Mira trying to find out. She was adopted as a small child. When her adoptive parents die, she finds out that she actually still owns the family home back in Las Vegas, New Mexico, which is truly the weirdest place on earth. Oh man. Talk about doing a book where the history of the place practically jumps up and down and asks for a magical explanation. Las Vegas, New Mexico will do it. And by the end of the book, she knows what happened to her mother. She knows who her father was, which she never did before. And boy, is that a strange answer. And she is contentedly settling into the old family home and is probably going to live out the rest of her life in Las Vegas, New Mexico. There's not another story there,
right,
unless we want to follow Mira and her boyfriend, probably someday husband, through their day-to-day lives in a very small town in New Mexico, and wondering when they have to go into Albuquerque to hit Costco to pick up supplies you can't get in a small town. There's not another story there. But when people really love Child, which I'm awfully glad about, because I do too, then it's sort of frustrating to have to say there isn't any more story other than you may be content, they live.
Right, you'd have to come up with some different complication in their lives.
Yeah.
I mean, which maybe you could do, but...
Yeah, and I mean, the obvious story would not be the story readers want to read, which is what happens to the family house, which is rather intelligent in its own right and likes having somebody of a certain bloodline living in it. And what happens when the house, Mira is in her 50s. She's not going to have a child. So do I write a book where Mira becomes, miraculous in her 50s and has to deal with that? It would really have to be the house's story. And I'm not ready to kill off Mira and Domingo just so I can have the house go looking for its heir apparent. I want them to continue living contentedly.
Well, it sounds wise. It's like, I have a rule about TV series that if the series starts with the characters in high school,
Mm-hmm.
when they graduate,
Mm-hmm.
the series is over.
Ah.
It's always a mistake.
You sound like you were a Buffy fan.
Yeah, that's a prime example.
Mm-hmm. I never watched Buffy because I apparently do not have the gene that makes one interested in stories involving vampires, whether they're the good guys or bad guys. So getting me to watch anything that involves vampires or read is very difficult, though when Alan and I, in our coursing through science fiction and fantasy tropes, did a separate piece just on vampire fiction, one of the comments was, I don't mind vampires, and you've read more vampire fiction than I do have. But it's because I keep looking for the book that's going to explain to me why people find vampires so appealing.
Have you read Susie's book?
Susie McKee Charnis's?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Now that's just a brilliant book. That's not a brilliant vampire book. I mean, she goes and she takes all of the illogical elements of the vampire motif, like, that they have these little teeny pointy canines but somehow can suck blood, and works it all out. I love the scenes where, in the first section of the book, the vampire goes to a psychiatrist and starts explaining why, using the motif of he's a man with the delusion that he's a vampire, so he can talk about being a vampire and the complications of being a vampire. Fred Saberhagen's Old Friend of the Family is also an appealing novel, but it's not an appealing novel because of the vampire stuff. It's an appealing novel because of the idea that you're in trouble and your family's always told you, well, we have an old friend of the family. If you ever get really badly in trouble, call on the old friend of the family, and it turns out to be Dracula. But it's that interests me, not the vampire element, the idea of your family has Dracula in its back pocket as the ultimate problem solver. I read An Old Friend of the Family. I never felt inclined to read any other of Fred's vampire books, but I did enjoy that. I'm more likely to get hooked by some cultural or mythological element, and that will be my hook. I think I've read everything, including books he wants to disavow by Tim Powers, because his twisted way of looking at reality, even in his very early novels where he was struggling to find his footing, you still see it there. Right? That's what'll get me excited. And TV shows, once they graduate.
Oh, it was...
It's a good idea. Because so much of the dynamic is that closed environment, and it's dynamic, and then you have to start making excuses to keep them together. I think that's something that's a problem with big series. A couple of years ago at Bubonicon, Brandon Sanderson, who took over writing for Robert Jordan in The Wheel of Time, came. And I very much enjoyed hearing Brandon speak. But he made the point that in a long series there comes a point where you need to make the decision, are you writing the book for a general readership or are you writing the book for the fans of the series? And he said the decision that was made for the Robert Jordan was there were a lot of very massive books and they could no longer be written at a level for entry into the Wheel of Time universe. They had to be written with the assumption of you've read at least some of the others. And he talked about how at the end there's a degree of difficulty because everybody has a favorite character and want to know what happens to that favorite character. And he had to try and figure out ways to do it that didn't involve forcing the issue to bring in a relatively minor character, because that relatively minor character actually had a subset of very passionate fans. And if I can babble for a moment more, the writer never knows who that minor character is going to be. So I remember with great fondness doing a signing for the third or fourth Firekeeper book. There was a young man who came. He was so shy that he couldn't even sit in the audience while I was doing my, 10-minute talk and then reading. He sat in a little coffee shop in the bookstore over there. Came up afterwards and he said, and I mean literally his hands were shaking. I felt bad. I didn't think I was that scary. And he managed to get out that he and his girlfriend and their best friend all loved the series, and he was the only one who was free to come, so he was bringing their books to get signed too. And then he said, "Doc, Elise, do they?" Because this was, compared to the sweeping plot elements in the story, the question as to whether two of the secondary characters would manage to get around the obstacles that led to them having a relationship. But it mattered to him, and it mattered to him so much that even though he was very shy, he found the courage to ask the question. I was really touched. But you never know what other things you put in a book are going to grab someone to that extent. It's, I'm not original in saying this, but there is this strange feeling when you write a book that it's until the book goes out, it's yours. And after that, it really belongs as much to any reader because they bring their life and experiences to the book and will react to different characters. Because they're filtering it through their set. And that's a very strange experience because you spend time with them, they're very much yours, they live in your head, you dream about them at night. And then there comes a moment where they suddenly belong to everybody else more than they belong to you. And it's an odd feeling.
Sounds like an odd feeling.
I'm not crazy, it really does happen.
Well, I've had you for quite a while. I should probably let you go here pretty soon.
Yeah, eventually I have to go home and continue to write about genetically altered pumas and such.
But one last question, which wasn't one of the things we talked about ahead of time.
Okay.
You mentioned that you went to that first science fiction convention and you walked in and you saw the young ladies in the fur bikinis.
Yes.
And you about turned around and walked out. And why was that your reaction?
Because despite being a reader of science fiction and fantasy for a long time, and I've grown up in an atmosphere where it was okay to read it, but if I ever heard people talk about fandom, it was in the snide, sneering context of those Trekkies with their pointed ears and all. Even though Washington, D.C. apparently has a very active fan community, I never knew it existed. So my only reference point was people who apparently can't cope with reality. Now, by the time I was going to this convention, I had had college, and I had friends who were in the SCA, and learned that no, there's actually some very productive things. But it was just I had been prepared to go to an academic conference and talk to the maybe screw up my courage to talk to the keynote author. I wasn't quite prepared to walk into that alien landscape, and I did find it a little bit hard to absorb. Later, especially after I was out of New York and I moved to South Central Virginia to take my first teaching job at a small college in Lynchburg, Virginia called Lynchburg College, there was a small local science fiction convention in a neighboring town, Roanoke, that we would go to, and I began to meet fans there in a smaller context than what to me just seemed like an overwhelming setting. And learned that far from maladjusted, many of them were among the most adjusted people I'd ever met, because rather than hiding from what interested them, they were cultivating it. Remember with great fondness the local Star Trek club. It was like a more Klingon branch of a Star Trek club that routinely did fundraisers for the local ambulance group. In fact, many of them were paramedics. And they did appearances at hospitals and went to see children and who were locked up because they were sick with leukemia or something. And I realized that actually fans were pretty darn marvelous people who they had the courage to walk around in fur bikinis and ferrets because they were happy and enjoying themselves. Not because they were maladjusted and this was their one moment to break out, but it was an adjustment point, I'll admit. But I did one costuming experience myself before I left Virginia. Right before I had sold the novels that were sitting there in the queue at Avon, and I realized I was at the transition point between being a pro and being just somebody going to a con. And so at that point, I was gaming with a group and we were playing the science fiction game Traveler.
Okay.
And in our particular game, I owned the starship and the other guys were the crew and the pilot and all the rest. And we decided that we would go to the convention in uniform as for our little trading ship. And I had a wonderful time. It was fun having people say, hey, I've noticed a bunch of you in the brown jumpsuits with the logo on the back. Are you together? Or one of my, I heard one of my friends say, are they with you? And they said, no, we're with her. Because, of course, it was my ship. Yeah, all my ships were named after the title. I had a small fleet, and all my ships were named after David Bowie songs. Lady Stardust and Moon Age Daydream. It's great. So that was nice. I got a little bit of a view of how much fun it was, and have never really looked at costume fans in the same way. Now I enjoy them and know what fun they're having. And they want you to come up and say, how did you manage to get the wings to stay on? So, yeah, there you go.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much, sir, and
Thank
for
you
your
very
time.
much, Jane.
It's been fun.
It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah.
So we've been talking to Jane Lindskold today. You can find Hamlet Revisited at snackreads.com. Soon you'll also find a story that Jane co-wrote with Fred Sabranian called Servant to Death.
Yes. Science fiction, exploding starships.
Yes, and of course, her many other fine works anywhere you can buy good books.
Right. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you.
Bye.